Let me tell you something uncomfortable. For years, I was taught that being humble meant keeping your head down, saying little, and not standing out. Until I understood something in Japan and Colombia. People don't recognize you for what you do in silence, but for what you dare to show. I once saw a brilliant man cleaning floors, while a less capable man received applause just for speaking louder. That's when I realized that I misunderstood. Humility makes you invisible, not noble. Today I want to make a little uncomfortable, to force you to stop disappearing and start taking up your real space. Misunderstood humility erases you from the map so slowly that you don't even realize it. You don't disappear suddenly. It's not dramatic. There's no big fall. You're just there one day and the next. No one consults you. No one listens to you. No one mentions you. And the worst thing is that you yourself help to build that invisibility. I remember something I saw when I lived in Japan. A co-worker was extremely competent. He solved problems that no one else could solve. He worked with near-perfect precision. But each time he finished something important, he said the same. It was nothing. Anyone can do that. At first, I thought it was modesty. But over time, I saw the real effect. His boss stopped assigning him big projects. Why? Because if it was nothing, then it wasn't relevant. And in the real world, irrelevant things aren't promoted. When I arrived in Colombia, I saw the opposite extreme. People who weren't necessarily the most skilled, but they were the most visible, the ones who talked about what they did, the ones who said, I led this, I solved this. And guess what happened? They advanced. Not always because they were better, but because they were visible. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. Talent without visibility is like a light turned off in a closed room. It can exist, but it doesn't illuminate anything. The problem isn't real humility. The problem is when humility becomes self-erasure, when you confuse. I'm not superior to anyone with I'm not good enough to be seen with the... And that becomes a dangerous habit because every time you downplay your accomplishments, you train the world to ignore you. Every time you say it wasn't that great, you're teaching. You're teaching the world how to treat you. I've seen people miss opportunities, not because they weren't capable, but because they never learned how to say what they did in meetings. They kept quiet so as not to seem arrogant. On projects, they let others present their work. On evaluations, they said, I got lucky, instead of explaining their effort. And then they wondered, why weren't they moving forward? The answer was simple. No one can value what they can't see clearly. Misunderstood humility also creates an internal trap. You start to feel that if you acknowledge your worth, you're doing something wrong. So you censor yourself, you become an expert at hiding your accomplishments, and little by little, without realizing it, you become someone easy to replace, easy to ignore, easy to forget. But there's something you need to understand clearly. The world isn't waiting to discover you. The world is busy. If you don't communicate your value, no one will do it for you. And that's not arrogance, it's reality. Acknowledging what you do well doesn't make you superior. It makes you visible. And being visible isn't a luxury, it's a necessity if you want to move forward. Because in the end, it doesn't erase your failure. It erases the silence about your own achievements. And when you understand that, you stop disappearing and start taking your real place. There's a dangerous confusion that many people drag around for years. They believe that being humble means saying, I'm not worth that much, I'm not that good. Anyone could be better than me. And that's not humility, that's a silent way of denying yourself. Humility isn't diminishing yourself. It's seeing clearly. It's being able to say, I did this well without feeling guilty. And at the same time, others can also do it well without feeling superior. That's the difference that almost no one understands. But that completely changes the way you live. I remember something I observed in Japan. There was an engineer who was excellent at his job, designing systems with impressive precision, but when interviewed, or Elisinion, Asked about his accomplishments, he always said the same thing. He's nothing special. Over time, the company stopped using him as a technical reference. Not because he wasn't good, but because he himself had trained everyone to believe that his work wasn't special, and the system simply treated him accordingly. Then I saw the opposite. In Colombia, a team with less technical training but with enormous clarity in communicating what they did. They said, we developed this solution, we managed to improve this process. There was no arrogance, there was clarity. And that team started to receive more projects, more visibility, more opportunities, not because they were necessarily superior, but because they knew how to recognize their own value without exaggerating it or hiding it. That's when I understood something fundamental. The problem is not recognizing your value, the problem is confusing that recognition with superiority. Because when you recognize yourself with superiority, you look down on others. But when you recognize yourself with honesty, you simply ground yourself in reality. I've seen talented people live in constant fear of seeming arrogant. So they censor themselves. If they do something well, they say it was luck. If they lead a project, they say they only helped a little. If someone congratulates them, they deflect the credit to others. And little by little, without realizing it, they disappear from the spaces where they could grow. Because the world doesn't work with internal intention, it works with external perception. If you can calmly say, I did this well, others won't figure it out for you. And if they don't see it, they don't value it. Not because they don't want to, but because they don't have enough information. True humility allows you to be at peace with yourself. You don't need to inflate yourself, but you don't need to erase yourself either. You can acknowledge I have skills without turning that into I'm better than others. And you can also acknowledge I still have a lot to learn without turning that into I'm worthless. When you achieve that balance, something changes. You stop hiding, you start speaking clearly about what you do, you start taking up your space without guilt, and most importantly, you stop apologizing for existing professionally, because in the end, the world doesn't need people who erase themselves. It needs people who know themselves, recognize themselves, and to show themselves with honesty. And at that point, humility stops being self-denial and becomes real strength. There is a truth that many people find uncomfortable, but that completely changes the way you understand success. The world doesn't reward what you do in silence. It rewards what it can see. You can be extremely good at what you do. You can have ideas. You can have brilliant. You can solve complex problems. But if that's not shown, it simply doesn't exist for others. And this is not unfair. It's simply how reality works, Kempa. Well, I remember a very clear experience when I worked with multicultural teams between Japan and Latin America, mostly. In Japan, I saw professionals who worked with impressive discipline. They arrived early, delivered impeccable work, took care of every detail. But at the end of the day, they didn't communicate it, they didn't present it, they didn't make it visible. Their mentality was that good work speaks for itself. But I discovered something important. Good work doesn't talk if no one listens to it. On the other hand, in Latin America, there was something different. People who weren't necessarily the most technical, but who knew how to present what they did, they said, this is what we achieved. This is the impact of the project. This is the result. And those people began to occupy larger spaces. Not because their work was always superior, but because their work was visible. And there I understood something that many learn late. What you don't show, the world ignores. Not because the world is cruel, but because it's busy. Everyone is focused on their own work, their own problems, their own goals. No one is waiting to discover your hidden talent. No one has the time to investigate what you don't explain. I've seen people miss out on huge opportunities simply because they never learned to show what they did. I remember a very competent professional who led an important project, finished it, successfully solved critical problems, even helped his team meet difficult goals. But when it came to the results meeting, he let others present the project, the project. When asked who really led it, his name didn't even come up strongly. Not because he hadn't put in the work, but because he didn't show it. Meanwhile, another person on the same team with less direct involvement but more communication skills ended up being recognized as the project leader, and it wasn't an intentional theft. It was simply visibility. That taught me something that seems harsh, but it's true. In the professional world, perception competes with talent, and if talent isn't shown, perception replaces it. I've also seen the other side. People who learn to communicate what they do without exaggeration, without arrogance, simply with clarity. They don't say, I'm the best. They say, this is what I did. And that simple difference changes their trajectory. Because showing your work is not showing off. It's allowing the world to understand your value. It's giving context. It's opening the door for others to recognize what already exists. When you start to understand this, you stop hiding your achievements. You start talking about your work when necessary. You start presenting your results without feeling guilty, and little by little, the world stops ignoring you, not because you changed what you do, but because started making it visible. And then you understand the central lesson: you don't lack talent, you lack visibility. There is a moment that defines your professional future more than you imagine. Meetings, not because of what you hear, but because of what you decide not to say. Because silence in a meeting is not neutral, it is a decision that has consequences. I remember something I observed when I was working with teams in Japan. The meetings were extremely orderly. Everyone listened with great respect. There was an almost perfect silence, but often the best ideas would remain locked away inside the minds of the individuals. They weren't said. They were thought about, analyzed, perfected, and then lost. Because someone less careful but quicker to speak would say something similar and get the credit. Later, I saw the other extreme. Meetings where people talked more, proposed more, discussed more, and although not everything was always perfect, the ideas circulated, were heard, and were made visible. That's when I understood something key. In a meeting, the best idea doesn't win. The idea that is said out loud wins. I've seen people with an incredible ability to remain silent for years. People who think deeply, who analyze better than others, but who don't open their mouths because they feel they might make mistakes or seem arrogant. And that fear turns them into spectators of their own future. Because two important things happen. In a meeting, decisions are made. And perceptions are formed. And if you don't speak up, you don't participate in either. You don't influence the decision, and you don't build the perception of your value either. I remember the case of a professional on a team who had very solid ideas. In private, his colleagues recognized him as brilliant, but in meetings, he always kept quiet. He said he preferred to listen, that he didn't want to interrupt, that it wasn't necessary to speak if others were already contributing. Over time, when promotions came, his name was never on the short list, not because he wasn't capable, but because no one associated him with visible leadership. Meanwhile, other colleagues who spoke up more, who proposed even imperfect ideas, began to be seen as role models, not because they always had the best answer, but because they had presence. And therein lies the uncomfortable truth. Silence doesn't just make you invisible, it makes you replaceable. Because in the absence of your voice, the system fills that space with someone else. I've also seen the other side. People who don't wait until they have the perfect idea to speak. They raise their hand, participate, and speak their minds respectfully. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they adjust. But they're always present in the conversation. And over time, These people end up occupying positions of influence, not just because of what they know, but because of what they represent. Speaking up in a meeting isn't arrogance, it's presence. In other words, I'm here, I have something to contribute, and my perspective matters. And if you don't do that, the message you send without words is the opposite. My presence isn't necessary. When you start to understand that something changes, you no longer go into a meeting just to listen. You understand that you're also there to build your place in the conversation. You don't need to talk all the time. You don't need to impose yourself, but you do need to exist within the conversation, because in the end, silence is not prudence. It's often the quietest way to miss opportunities. And there's an idea that many admire about Japan, but few truly understand. Discipline isn't just about doing things right, it's also about making sure they look right. I've seen a culture in Japan where attention to detail matters even when no one is looking. Work is done with precision, order, and respect, but there's something that many people outside of that context don't adopt: communicating. The results ontisane. Because doing something well in silence doesn't guarantee recognition. It only guarantees personal satisfaction. And sometimes even that isn't enough to move forward. I clearly remember a situation with the technical team. A worker was extremely disciplined. His code was clean. His solutions were efficient. His results were impeccable. But every time he finished something important, he simply handed it in without context, without explanation, without explanation, without highlighting its impact. For him, the work spoke for itself. But the problem is that the system doesn't listen to work. It listens to people. Over time, I saw how other colleagues with less technical skills began to receive more visibility, not because their work was better, but because they knew how to present it. They would say, this is what we improved. This is the problem we solved. This is the impact we generated. And suddenly, the same type of effort started to have more value, not because it changed, but because it became visible. That's when I understood something key. Discipline without visibility is incomplete. Later, when I observed teams in Latin America, I saw a different dynamic. People who not only worked, but also communicated what they did, not arrogantly, but clearly. They showed results, explained processes, connected their work with real impact. And those people advanced faster, not necessarily they worked harder, but because their discipline had a second layer communication. Pilepas. I've seen very disciplined people get stuck for years. They show up early, they deliver everything, they deliver quality, but no one outside their immediate circle knows what they do. And then they wonder, why do others advance? The answer is simple. The system doesn't reward the invisible, it rewards the understandable. I've also seen the opposite mistake. People who talk a lot, but don't do enough, and those people eventually fall apart due to lack of substance. But the point is not to choose between doing or showing. The point is to unite the two. Japanese discipline, properly understood, is twofold. First, you do the job with excellence. Then you make sure that that work is understood, recognized, and contextualized. It's not about showing off. It's about communicating responsibly. Because if you do something great, but no one understands it, to the system, it's as if it doesn't exist. And if you make it visible, but it's not great, eventually it gets exposed. But when you bring the two together, that's where real progress happens. I remember a case of a professional who changed his career simply by tweaking this and that. He didn't start working harder or doing different things. He just started explaining what he was already doing better. In meetings, he would say what he had achieved, what impact his work had, problems he was solving. And in a few months, his visibility changed completely. That wasn't luck. It was discipline applied to communication. Because in the end, complete discipline isn't just silent execution, it's execution with presence. And when you understand that, your work stops being invisible and starts becoming an opportunity. There's a phenomenon that almost no one wants to admit because it's too uncomfortable. False humility doesn't make you a better person. It makes you useful for people who benefit from your invisibility. I've seen this repeated in different environments, in Japan, in Latin America, in large and small companies, extremely capable people with real talent who, in order not to appear arrogant, end up letting others who are less qualified take their place, their credit, and their opportunities. I remember a situation in a team where an important project was developed in a large part by a single person. He was someone very competent, meticulous, responsible. But when it came time to present the results, he said, it wasn't just mine. It was pang work. Point quiz. And although that sounds noble, the problem is that he erased his own contribution. As a result, the next time another member of the team was assigned as the visible leader of the next project, not because he knew more, but because he was the one who showed up the most. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. False humility does not eliminate hierarchies. It only changes who benefits from them. In Japan, I've seen the other extreme to people who work with impressive discipline but never claim their space. They never say, oh, I led this, I solved this problem. They believe that work should speak for itself. But in practice, the system doesn't reward the implicit, it rewards the explicit. Meanwhile, there are other types of people, not necessarily more talented, but more strategic in their visibility. They know how to say, I participated, I proposed this solution, I coordinated this. And little by little, without necessarily doing more work, they begin to occupy more space. Not because they cheat the system, but because the system responds to what it can see. False humility creates a dangerous dynamic. You make yourself small, and someone else grows with your work. You minimize your contribution, and someone else maximizes it. You say it's not a big deal, and someone else says that was key. And the world that has no internal context believes the most visible version. I've seen people get stuck not because of a lack of ability, but because of an excessive misunderstood modesty. And while they wait to be recognized on their own, others learn to communicate their value without fear, and they move forward. The hardest part about this is that false humility doesn't just hurt you, it also feeds mediocre people because it allows them to operate in an environment where they don't need to be exceptional, they just need to be visible. And when you don't take up your space, that space doesn't go away, someone else takes it. Yeah. I've also seen this become a cultural pattern in some teams. The quieter people end up doing the heavy lifting, while the more visible ones get the recognition. And over time, that's not only unfair, it's demotivating. Because the implicit message is, it doesn't matter how much you do, it matters how much is seen. But the most important thing to understand is this. True humility doesn't ask you to erase yourself. It asks you to be honest. If you did something, say so. If you led something, acknowledge it. If you contributed, express it. Without exaggeration, without superiority, but without disappearing. Because when you erase yourself, you're not being virtuous. You're leaving the field open for others to grow with what you built. And at that point, false humility ceases to be a virtue and becomes the best ally of visible mediocrity. There's a lesson that is often learned late and sometimes too late. The world does not evaluate what you were trying to do. It evaluates what is truly seen of you at the moment when it counts. You can have the best intentions. You can work with dedication. You can try harder than others. But if your presence is not where decisions are being made, if your work is not noticed when it matters, then the result or the system is the same as if you had not been there. Well, I remember something very clearly from my experience with Japan and Latin America. In Japan, many people work with impeccable intention. They do their work with care, respect, and discipline. But sometimes they assume that this intention will be enough to be recognized, as if internal effort would automatically. True si trek certo de trem I, humidi trem inisi dextren modar visibility. But the system does not work that way. In Latin America, however, I saw something else. People who understood that it's not enough to just do. You have to be there, be in the conversation, be in the meeting, be there when decisions are being made, because that's where presence becomes impacto. I've seen professionals with elementary gabashkus completely miss out on important opportunities simply because they weren't there when they were being talked about, not because they weren't capable, but because they weren't visible at the key moment. I remember a case of someone who worked for months on a complex project. He did it with dedication, solving difficult problems, providing valuable solutions. But when it came time to present the project to management, he wasn't the one to explain it. He preferred to stay in the background, thinking that the work would speak for itself. The result was that someone else presented the project, explained it, defended it, and ended up being recognized as the face of Saya SAS. The intention was the same, the effort was the same, but the presence wasn't. And in the real world, that changes everything. I've also seen people who don't necessarily do more than others, but are present where it matters. They speak up in meetings, they explain their work, they connect their accomplishments with results, and that constant presence builds a perception of someone who is engaged, who leads, who contributes. Because the truth is simple. The salitaro, intention lives within you, but presence lives in the perception of others, and the world can't value what it doesn't perceive. I've seen people get deeply frustrated saying, I do a lot, but no one recognizes it. When you analyze their situation, you find something recurring. Their work isn't visible at key moments. They don't show up. They don't talk. They don't act. Intention is high, but presence is low. Meanwhile, others with less effort but more visibility take their place in the narrative of success. Not because they're deceiving, but because the system always favors what it can see. Intention is important, of course it is. But intention without presence is invisible. And the invisible doesn't compete. When you begin to understand this, you change the way you act. You stop relying solely on internal effort, and you also start taking care of how you appear in important spaces, not to show off, but to exist within the system where your future is decided. Because in the end, the world doesn't reward you for what you wanted to do. It rewards you for what you did visibly. There's an idea that many people find hard to accept because they've been raised to avoid conflict at all costs. Asking for what you deserve isn't arrogance, it's justice. And when I say this, I don't mean demanding without reason or asking for more than you deserve. I'm referring to something much simpler, yet more uncomfortable. Knowing your value and stating it sans guilt. Well, I've seen this repeated many times in work environments in Japan and Latin America. Highly skilled, responsible, disciplined people who do their job with excellence, but when the time comes to negotiate, ask for a raise, request a promotion, or defend their position, they remain silent, not because they don't necessary, but because they feel that asking for it is inappropriate. With that thought, don't reson. I remember the case of a professional who had been doing exceptional work for years. His performance was consistent. His results were measurable. His impact was evident. But when his supervisor asked him if he thought he deserved a promotion, he replied, "If you think so, fine." He didn't present a case. He didn't defend his track record. He didn't express his value and that opportunity went to someone else who did. Not because he was better, but because he dared to ask for it. That's when I understood something important. The system doesn't just reward merit, it also rewards communicating that merit. In Japan, I've seen cultural tendency to avoid conflict and direct self-assertion. Many people believe that if they do a good job, it will be enough. But in practice, silence is not interpreted as humility. It is interpreted as a lack of interest or even a lack of ambition. And that has consequences. In Latin America, on the other hand, I have seen people who understand that asking is not an act of ego, but of clarity. They say, this is the value I bring. This is why I deserve this position. This is the impact I've made. And in doing that, they're not being arrogant. They're being transparent. I've seen people get stuck at the same level for years, not because they don't deserve it, but because they never asked for it. And while they're waiting for someone to notice their effort, others who are more visible step into the shoes that they could have. And here's the most important part. No one is going to advocate for your value more intensely than you are. The system isn't designed to guess what you deserve. It's designed to respond to what you express. Asking for what you deserve isn't saying I'm better than others. It's saying, this is what I've done, and this is what I deserve based on that. It's fairness, because it balances the ratio of what you give to what you get. I've also seen the opposite effect. People who learn to ask without aggression, without superiority, but with assertiveness. And those people start to change their trajectory, not because they're suddenly more capable, but because they're more capable. But because they cease to be invisible at the moment when their growth is decided. When you understand this, something changes inside you. You stop expecting recognition as if it were a spontaneous award. And you start to actively participate in the conversation about your value. Because in the end, not asking for what you deserve, it's silently renouncing your own place. There is something deeply uncomfortable when you truly understand it. Many people are not invisible due to bad luck, but because they have trained that invisibility for years without realizing it. Oro. And when I say trained, I am not a light metaphor. It is exactly that. Every time you minimize your achievement, every time you say it was nothing, every time you keep quiet in a meeting, every time you let someone else take credit for your work, you are repeating a behavior. And what is repeated becomes identity. Well, I have seen this early in different work environments between Japan and Latin America. In Japan, many people develop a low-profile culture. They work with excellence, but they avoid the standing out. They avoid talking. Their achievements, they avoid taking up space. At first, it seems like a virtue, but over time, it becomes a pattern. Extremely capable people are moved pass over for important opportunities simply because they are not associated with visibility. I remember a case of a brilliant professional who solved complex technical problems with impressive ease, but he had a habit. He never talked about what he did. When someone congratulated him, he would respond with phrases like, it's no big deal, or I just did my job, and his name stopped coming up in promotion conversations. Not because he had lost ability, but because he had lost presence. In contrast, I've seen something different in Latin America. People who are not always the most technical, but who have learned not to disappear. They talk about their work, explain what they do, make sure their attribution is understood, and that completely changes their trajectory. That's when I understood something key. Invisibility is not a fixed state, it's a habit. And like all habits, it's built through repetition. If for years you train your environment not to see you, they learn not to see you. If for years you train others to take credit for you, eventually they will do so without question. If for years you train others to take credit for you, they will eventually. You train yourself not to speak, not to ask, not to show, then invisibility ceases to be a circumstance and becomes automatic behavior. I have seen talented people trapped in this pattern for decades, not because someone has forced them to remain silent, but because no one has taught them that the opposite can also be trained. Nelis. Presence, communication, visibility. And the most important thing is to understand that this training is not conscious at first. It starts with small decisions. I'll say nothing to not disturb. It is better not to mention my achievement so as not to seem arrogant. It is better to let someone else explain it. And each of these decisions seems innocent, but added together they build a version of you that disappears within the system. Meanwhile, other people train the opposite. They don't exaggerate or manipulate, but they speak, participate, and explain their value. So the system eventually learns to see them. Because the world does not respond to your potential, it responds to your pattern. When you understand this, you realize something powerful. If invisibility has been trained, it can also be untrained. You do not need to become someone different. You just need to stop reinforcing the habit of disappearing. Start saying, I did this. Start explaining your contribution. Start being present at key moments. It's not arrogance. It's re-educating your own presence. And at that moment, you understand the central truth. You weren't born invisible. You trained yourself to be that way. And you can train yourself to stop being that way. There's an idea that seems contradictory at first, but it's essential to understanding this topic. You can force yourself to be seen without ceasing to be correct. Because many people believe that there are only two options. Either be humble and disappear, or be visible and become arrogant. And that's a lie that has kept many talented people in the shadows for years. I've seen this conflict many times in work environments between Japan and Latin America. In Japan, there's a strong inclination toward correctness, respect, and not standing out unnecessarily. That creates people kurgiri discipline, but sometimes tugatahams too silent. In Latin America, I've seen the opposite, people who are very expressive, very visible, but sometimes without a filter. And both extremes have problems. But the interesting thing happens when you find the balance. People who do their job with excellence while ensuring that their work is visible, understood, and recognized without losing respect for others. I remember a case of a professional who worked with great technical precision. He was respected internally by his team, but outside that circle, he was practically unknown. He never talked about his achievements. He never presented his results clearly. He never took up space in meetings. He said he wanted to be correct, not to draw attention to himself. Over time, when promotion opportunities came, his name was not on the list. Not because he was incapable, but because he was not visible. And there he understood something hard. Correction without visibility can become an elegant form of stagnation. Forcing yourself to be seen does not mean interrupting. It does not mean imposing. It does not mean exaggerating. It means something much simpler and more difficult. Being present with clarity means saying in a meeting, this is what I have done and this is the impact it has had. It means responding to recognition with a simple thank you without minimizing it. It means participating in the conversation about your own value without feeling guilty. I have seen people completely change their trajectory without changing their ability. Only by changing their visibility, they began to speak up of their work naturally. They began to explain their accomplishments without exaggeration. They began to take up their space without asking for emotional permission. And something important happens when you do this correctly. You don't lose respect, you gain it. Because people don't respect invisibility, they respect clarity. They respect those who can say what they do without needing to belittle others. They respect those who can shine without turning anyone off. Forcing yourself to be seen also means breaking with that inner voice that tells you that you're doing something wrong when you acknowledge yourself. That voice that mistakes humility for disappearance. That voice that makes you feel guilty for taking up space. But taking up space is not abuse. It's a right. And doing it without losing propriety means always maintaining respect. Not comparing yourself to humiliate, not exaggerating to impress, not competing to destroy, just existing with honesty. I've seen people go from invisible to recognized simply by learning this, not changing who they are, but allowing who they are to be seen. And when you understand this deeply, you realize something liberating. It can be right and visible at the same time. You don't have to choose between being respected or being seen. You can be both. And that's where real change begins. When you stop disappearing and start showing up with integrity, and in the end, it all comes down to one internal decision: to stop confusing yourself between humility and disappearing. Because for years you were taught that the right thing to do was to lower your voice, to reduce your presence, to minimize your accomplishments, to wait in silence. But real life doesn't work that way. The world doesn't adjust its perception to your intention. It adjusts its response to what it can see, what it can understand, what you are willing to show. When it's not about becoming someone else. It's not about shouting louder or competing for attention or puffing yourself up to take up space. It's about something much deeper and more honest. To stop betraying yourself by hiding what you are capable of. Because every time you make yourself small in order to be less of a bother, you are training the world to see you as small. And every time you acknowledge yourself clearly without arrogance, you are training the world to respect you precisely. Forcing yourself to be seen is not an act of ego. It is an act of responsibility towards yourself. It is about stopping waiting for someone to discover what you already know you are capable of doing. It is about stopping living in a reduced version of yourself for fear of the opinion of others. And here is the most important truth of all. The people who truly add value to the world are not those who hide the best. They are those who express themselves honestly, who do their job well but also communicate it well, who do not need to exaggerate but do not need to disappear either. When you start to live this way, something in your world shifts. You are no longer invisible. You are no longer ignored. You are no longer replaced by silence. You begin to occupy your natural place without asking permission to exist. And then you understand it with absolute clarity. You were not meant to be small. You were used to not being seen. And today that habit ends.